So we have some major developments in the battle to end the NFA's suppressor restrictions. This comes after the Trump DOJ shifted its position and admitted that suppressors are in fact protected arms under the Second Amendment. But despite that shift, the DOJ is still defending the NFA. And now we have a case officially up in front of the Supreme Court seeking review of the Supreme Court and essentially asking the court there to decide whether the NFA's registration and taxation scheme for suppressors does in fact violate the Second Amendment. And now we have some major procedural updates that can kind of tell us how the Supreme Court is maybe going to treat this case going forward. So let's break down what just happened in this challenge. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about a critical suppressor/NFA case that is currently seeking Supreme Court review. This case has now reached the United States Supreme Court, and it asks the court to review the NFA's restrictions on suppressors. Now, for those unfamiliar with this case, it started back in Louisiana back in 2022, where federal and state law enforcement officers executed warrants at Mr. Peterson's property, where he also had a home-based FFL. Now, among the items recovered at that location were some solvent traps. I believe maybe it was just one solvent trap in his bedroom safe, and the government treated that solvent trap as an unregistered suppressor under the NFA. Mr. Peterson was then charged with the possession of an unregistered suppressor, and in response to that, he moved to dismiss the charge, arguing that the NFA's suppressor and registration and taxation schemes violate the Second Amendment. So the district court on review eventually rejected that argument and upheld the charge against him. This case eventually then went to the Fifth Circuit, and at first review of this case, the three-judge panel ruled that suppressors were not protected arms at all, and so they rejected this position as well. This case then went to the Fifth Circuit, and on first review, the three-judge panel ruled that suppressors are not protected arms at all, but then something changed. The Trump DOJ changed over, and then they got the control of this case, and they changed their position and admitted that suppressors are in fact protected arms under the Second Amendment. That forced the Fifth Circuit to withdraw its original ruling, but then on re-review of this case, they issued a new ruling, still upheld the NFA, but they just used a different theory. The Fifth Circuit assumed that suppressors are protected arms under the Second Amendment, but it still upheld the NFA by saying that suppressors and this system works like a shall-issue licensing regime. In other words, the court treated the NFA like a shall-issue permit system. And so under that logic, if the government processes the paperwork objectively and doesn't have discretion to deny applications, well then the restrictions they say should still be constitutional. So even though suppressors may be protected arms, the Fifth Circuit said that the NFA survives under Bruin because this operates like a shall-issue CCW licensing scheme. So that ruling created some serious controversy. So essentially, because if that logic stands, it could justify many types of firearms restrictions on these types of protected arms simply by saying and essentially labeling these regimes as shall issue licensing. And that is exactly why this case is now heading to the Supreme Court. Mr. Peterson's legal team officially filed their petition for writ of cert, asking for the Supreme Court to take this issue up and to review this case. The petition presented two major questions that they want the Supreme Court to address. First, can the NFA's taxation and registration system be treated like a licensing law? And second, does the NFA violate the Second Amendment as applied to suppressors? Now, here's where things get very interesting procedurally in what is developed on this case. On March 30th, the United States filed a waiver of its right to respond to this cert petition. So that's not entirely kind of atypical. In a lot of cases, you may see, the government waive their right to respond and simply wait until the Supreme Court issues an order ordering them to file that response. Normally, when a case raises some serious constitutional questions, the Supreme Court will either order the government to respond or the government will voluntarily file a response on their own, trying to defend what the lower court said. But here, the DOJ chose not to respond at all. And also, right now, we have not seen the Supreme Court order a response from the DOJ. But also what has developed, which is a little bit concerning, it could be neutral, but also it's something we need to keep our eyes on, is the fact that just 2 days later on April 1st, the Supreme Court distributed this case for conference, which will take place on April 17th. This may be another key step because now the justices will privately get together and decide what they want to do with the petition. But also importantly, as I mentioned, as of right now, The Supreme Court has not ordered a response from the government. The government has waived that response. We have not seen an order from the Supreme Court saying we want you to file a response, but instead, right after that, we saw this was scheduled for conference. Again, that could just be something, procedurally that happens within the Supreme Court where the clerks are just saying, we're going to schedule this for the next date. And now we have a time period where we're going to have to watch the docket to see if the Supreme Court orders a response from the government. So what could this procedurally tell us about the posture of this case and where this may be heading? First, the waiver typically suggests that the government, here the DOJ, does not believe this case warrants Supreme Court review and that this will just be simply rejected by the Supreme Court. Second, the fact that the court has distributed this case and we have not seen an order seeking a response from the DOJ can raise some red flags, and that's why I said we have to watch the docket to see what happens. The absence of a response, and if this case actually ends up going to that conference date without an order from the court saying to file a response, that could be a bad sign. It could just signal also that the court has no interest in this case and with this issue at all, and maybe they're just going to outright deny it. I will note that there are going to be multiple amicus briefs filed in support of Mr. Peterson and the 2A side, which may also pique the Supreme Court's interest and move them to file an order and essentially order the DOJ to file their response. So now let's talk about what may happen next. Now, leading up to this current, set conference date on April 17th, we're going to be looking at the amicus briefs filed, and hopefully we'll also be watching the docket to see if the Supreme Court will eventually actually request a response from the DOJ, and then, maybe move the conference date as well, because if a response is filed, they're probably going to move that conference date, and I think that's going to be the best case scenario for this case. Without a response being ordered, I don't have a lot of faith that the Peterson case will survive that conference date on April 17th, and it may simply signal that the Supreme Court is just going to outright deny the case. The court could also relist the case for another conference, which may signal at least one of the Supreme Court justices is taking a closer look at this case, but without, full arguments and full briefing before that conference or going into that conference, it is still something concerning that we need to watch for. Of course, there's also always the off chance that this goes to conference with a waiver of the DOJ, no response, and then maybe we still get a grant or a quick, per curiam opinion from the Supreme Court. But again, those chances are very slim, and I, don't have a lot of faith that something like that would actually happen. So this case is important because it warns that the Fifth Circuit's ruling has no clear limiting principle. Because if the NFA can survive simply by being labeled a licensing scheme, the same logic could potentially apply to many other firearms restrictions. So in other words, the federal government or maybe any state could theoretically require registration and taxation for any type of protected arms by simply saying, well, this is a shall issue scheme. That's why this case goes far beyond suppressors and the NFA, and hopefully the Supreme Court takes this case serious. So now all eyes will be on the docket to see if a response is ordered before that April 17th conference, or if this just simply moves to conference without any response from the DOJ. So that's what's currently happening in this critical suppressor challenge. That's where this stands. You have the Fifth Circuit upheld the NFA, saying that it's a shall issue licensing scheme. Mr. Peterson has asked for the Supreme Court to intervene. The government has waived their response, and in response to that, this case has been currently set for conference without any actual filed response from the DOJ. So again, we're going to be watching to see how this develops. As we get more information, as this unravels more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.